Tighten your seat belts. This is day 2. Rubber hits the road. So good morning. Welcome to Bevan Symposium 2014 Part 2. Couple of things from yesterday, which I was just told by David. Where is David? Is he? He's probably solving the problems of the universe. I was told that yesterday we had a total of 400 people actually watching remotely. So that's pretty impressive. At one stage we had 100 at one go. So and the cool thing was that the number of people watching actually increased during the day. So even with competition of NBA basketball, listening to Chris Anderson talk about mixed stock exemptions just blew basketball away last night. The only interesting other fact is during lunch, apparently 7 people watched, and I was really interested to see what their lives must be like. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time. It's my honor to introduce the moderator for session 3, Merrick, the man who does not know how to say no. Otherwise he probably wouldn't be here. Merrick is currently the Executive Director of the Marine Conservation Alliance. He, like many of our speakers and moderators, has done a few things in his time. He claims not to be a UW grad, which, as you know from Steve's talk, is a real negative, but we might forgive you for that. He's worked for NIMS. I first met him when he was a staff officer at the Pacific Fishery Management Council. After that, he worked for a while at EDF, and now he, as I said before, is with Marine Conservation Alliance. So, and he's been absolutely central to making this whole event happen. And so I hand over the microphone. I already gave you the 10-minute thing. You're the man.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Andre. Well, good morning, everybody. Like Andre said, I'm Merrick, and I hope you're looking forward to this morning's session. This morning, I think what you're going to hear is a bit of a story about how the rubber hits the road, how the councils are implementing the Sustainable Fisheries Act and the last reauthorization. You're going to hear about what the industry and private arrangements are doing to respond to some of these requirements. And it's going to leave you with, I think, a question. And what I mean by that is we're going to go through this storyline, I think starting with about 1996 for the North Pacific Council, a little bit earlier, about how annual catch limits have been implemented in these councils, how they've responded to overfishing, and in the Pacific Council, how they've responded to rebuilding mandates. You're going to hear about some of the tools that the councils have developed to respond to these requirements. And you'll hear about how the industry and private stakeholders are organizing themselves under a tool we often refer to as harvesting cooperatives, and the types of benefits that are spinning off from that. So originally, these harvesting cooperatives were set up to do things like organize harvesting activity, increase profitability in the fishery sectors, and as we've seen is that these institutions create additional benefits. And so I think the question here as we're thinking about Magnuson is, what else is possible? Do we want to keep going down this road? If we do, what sort of changes in the law are necessary? So think about that as you're listening to these talks. To start off this morning, we're very fortunate to have the directors of the North Pacific Council and the Pacific Council, which in my view are the two preeminent councils in the nation. I won't spend a whole lot of time introducing both of these gentlemen, but we'll start with Dr. Don McIsaac. Don has been the director of the Pacific Council since about the time the West Coast groundfish fishery hit rock bottom. And he's successfully, I think, steered the Pacific Council through a probably the most exciting time in that council's history, through addressing rebuilding mandates, through implementing essential fish habitat provisions, embarking down the road of ecosystem-based fishery management, and more recently the Pacific Rationalization Program. Chris Oliver, I doubt, needs any introduction. The North Pacific Council, I think we're all familiar with that. Chris has been at the North Pacific Council for, over 20 years. Been a part of what we all know as one of probably the most preeminent council in the nation, really a model for the rest of the world to follow. and Chris has been at the helm for many exciting events as well. So I won't spend too much more time, but Don, I'd like to introduce you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Merrick. It's nice to be back here at the UW. It's nice to be back here in the Fisheries auditorium. And it's nice to see all the students here learning about the Magnuson Act. I'd like to also thank David and Andre for putting this all together and for the nice reception last night. And, you know, yesterday we heard a little bit about the North Pacific Council. Just heard a little bit more about the North Pacific Council. And the North Pacific Council has done this, and the North Pacific Council has done that.
Senate Commerce Committee.
Where's Bud at? He said, my favorite council is the North Pacific Council. So last night at the reception, a student came up to me and said, Don, you know, I heard about the North Pacific Council, and I've heard about the Western Pacific Council, and those are just subsidiaries of the Pacific Council, aren't they? So we'll see here. So anyway, I'm here to give a perspective on the Pacific Council. And if I can press the right button, no, I gotta go here, don't I? And then here. Okay, there we go. Give a shot at this here and get my glasses out. And so, as Bud said yesterday, you know, the Magnuson created the councils. The Magnuson Act dictates how we operate. It determines our success and it determines our failures with regard to living up to what the people expect for marine fishery management in terms of conserving fish stocks and optimal management for societal benefits from doing so. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Pacific Council to date on this question of Magnuson reauthorization, and then I'm going to select out just two topics to get a little more specific about. So with regard to the process to date, and it's a very important issue to the Council, we're following it very closely, and we've got quite a bit of things on record that I hope all the students can find on the Pacific Council website. In preparing for the big Managing Our Nation's Fisheries 3 conference at our March or April council meeting in 2013, we wrestled with trying to come up with 3 priorities to bring forward at that national conference. And Dorothy Lohman, the Pacific Council chair, presented those, and those are available on the Managing Our Nation's Fisheries 3 website, along with that of the other councils. Then the big national conference came around, and 128 findings came out. Dave and others spoke to that yesterday. And so the proceedings are out now. They're available online as well. After the conference, the Pacific Council and its advisory bodies considered those 128 findings, many of which dealt directly with reauthorization issues, and spent some time at the June, the September, and the November council meetings wrestling with those and others that might not have come up, and refined those down to about 20 priority areas. And so if you go on our website and look at the briefing books for those council meetings, you'll see all those materials there. We sent a letter dated November 12th to Senator Mark Begich and Chairman Doc Hastings that describes these 20 priorities, and that's available again on our council website. The House discussion draft came out on December 18th, and the council considered that at its March meeting. Prior to that, I testified at the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Oceans, Atmospheres, and Fisheries and Coast Guard hearing on January 30th, and Dorothy Lohman testified before the U.S. House Natural Resources Committee on February 28th, and the contents of our written testimony is available on our website as well. So the council took the discussion draft up in March, and on March 25th sent in a letter to Doc Hastings and Dave Whaley and all the folks with a response to that. And again, that's available online. And now we've got the Senate discussion draft out there, and the council's legislative committee and the full council is scheduled to take that up in June at our June council meeting toward the end of the month. Now, yesterday we heard Bob King say that they are looking maybe for some Senate action in the committee level by mid-May, so we're kind of hoping that maybe that timeline could perhaps get relaxed so that the Pacific Council process could weigh in on that important draft. And that involves, again, just our legislative committee, all the advisory bodies, the SSC, and the public, of course, as well. It's a pretty thorough process, and so we hope we're going to have a chance to put something in on that. If it turns out that there's another draft available before then, of course, we'll just do the best we can. So anyway, there's been a lot of process so far, and a lot of this material is on our website. Before I speak to these two issues specifically, I'd like to emphasize the point that the Pacific Council believes the Magnuson Act, as it currently stands, has been a success. It's worked well to ensure a science-based process that ensures long-term sustainable fisheries while preventing overfishing and mandating rebuilding of depleted stocks. Under the Act, as it stands, the Pacific Council has ended overfishing in West Coast waters of any and all stocks within 1 year of detection, has rebuilt 7 depleted stocks, and is in the process of successfully rebuilding 8 stocks that remain depleted, 3 of which are projected to be rebuilt in this next year. We've implemented a successful groundfish trawl individual quota catch share program that's been held up as a model for programs in other regions for its ability to reduce bycatch and increase economic yield. We annually craft ocean salmon fisheries that accomplish stock-specific conservation goals for a multitude of individual salmon stocks, including many that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And we just finished our March and April council process this year to do that once again. We've instituted a fishery regime for sardines that precautionarily sets aside 150,000 metric tons for such things as non-human predators in the ecosystem. We've created an ecosystem fishery management plan, which we are now in the process of implementing, along with protections for a multitude of unmanaged forage fish. We're successfully participating in international fisheries organizations to protect highly migratory tuna-like species and the West Coast fisheries that rely on them. The current Magnuson Act has been a key driver in these successes. We believe large-scale changes to the Magnuson Act are not warranted, and any changes to the Act should be carefully considered. Still, there is room for improvement. Things can get better. Despite the effectiveness of the Magnuson Act, the Pacific Council believes there are areas that can be refined in order to improve marine fishery management in the United States and internationally. And as I said, I'm not going to be able to go over the 20 that the Pacific Council think are priority matters. I'm going to focus just on 2. And these 2 were within the 3 that Dorothy put forward way back in May of last year. This was prior to the 128 findings, prior to Chairman Hastings' discussion draft, prior to the Senate discussion draft, and they still survive as areas of high interest to focus on. So, one of the 2 that I'm going to bring up is better alignment and streamlining of the National Environmental Policy Act with the Magnuson Act processes. So there are some problems here with the current system of complying with NEPA in the fishery management world. NEPA was adopted as a law in 1969, and it was relatively short, but since then the guidelines and the procedures have grown and grown and grown, and they're quite extensive now. A longtime Pacific Council Deputy Director John Kuhn has a pretty good line about this, where he says the preparation of an environmental impact statement was originally meant for the construction of a dam, something that might last for 100 years, not for routine fishery season elements that might change every couple of years. We heard yesterday about the 7,000-page gigantor environmental impact statement in North Pacific for groundfish fishing regulations. We've heard before that nuclear power plant EIS took 250 pages at one point some years ago. So we're now looking at doing an environmental impact statement on routine groundfish matters every 2 years. This is changes to how many fish should be caught based on the most recent stock assessment. Changes in the bag limit for sport fisheries. You know, should this really require an environmental impact statement to do that? And we do a little bit more most every biennial cycle, but the essence of it is routine fishery management stuff. And is this really of the same magnitude as building a nuclear power plant? As another example, right now we're looking in the world of electronic monitoring of replacing the 100% human observer requirement with cameras. Cameras that might be on the boat here or there, cameras that look outside the boat. And there is an opinion out there that we might need to do an environmental impact statement, the full ball of wax, to consider electronic monitoring. And this comes after, on the heels of doing a big EIS to do the catch share program to start with that called for the 100% observers. But it's a legitimate perspective that it would take an EIS to do this because you get down to words like significance, and you get into looking at the procedures and the guidelines, and when do you really do an environmental impact statement that takes so long, and when can you do an environmental assessment, or when can you do a categorical exclusion? And I mean, I'm just saying it's a legitimate perspective that an EIS would be required for what I'll call a little tiny thing like that. It's important, but it's not building a dam. There's a problem with regard to time, and I think that yesterday we heard a little bit about it taking more than a year, and it can certainly be longer than that. NEPA calls for 2 separate public comment periods interspaced by a significant agency process after final council action. Now, to get to final council action, you've already had some formal public comment periods and a lot of interaction. So it is a lengthy process to combine compliance with these 2 laws. And when it takes a real long time, you can run into your science getting obsolete and a variety of other problems. I won't go through all of these. Dave Whaley did a good job yesterday of listing off a litany of many different problems. Workload problems, I don't want to minimize those. The council staff spends an enormous amount of time preparing environmental impact statement documents. Frank Lockhart's staff spends an enormous amount of time going through the rest of the NEPA process on that. And so this comes at a cost of all this staff resources being used to do something maybe, well, something important. I want to say the complying with NEPA is not important. As you'll see in a minute, we do believe a thorough environmental review process needs to occur. Duplicity of process, certainly duplicity of public comment periods, there's a lot of problems. So in 2007, the Magnuson Act was reauthorized, and it's quite an improvement. Like I said, we really like what's in here by and large. It called for some sort of NEPA fix. It was in section 304I, and it was supposed to happen pretty quickly. I think within 6 months, the secretary was supposed to do this. And within a year, I think things were supposed to be in a state of better than they are now. That section 304I called for an alignment of NEPA and the Magnuson Act regulatory process so as to be more timely, quicker, more concise, a little less process, maybe not 7,000 pages. But 304I did not happen in our view. There was some work done on that, but in our view, it hasn't become quicker, and it hasn't become less process. We like the House discussion draft that it dealt with the concept of addressing this NEPA Magnuson Act problem, but feel a bit more is needed to ensure the thoroughness of the environmental analysis prior to a council vote. We like it that the Senate discussion draft brought up the NEPA Magnuson Act problem, but again feel a little bit more is needed to adequately ensure that streamlining, conciseness, and better alignment actually does occur this time. We did not see any enforcement or default provisions that kind of go along essentially with what we see as the current 304I language being repeated. So what to do about this? Well, we're looking at a little bit of a new approach. We're going to bring this forward in some work groups that come to the annual Council Coordination Committee meeting in mid-May that call for instituting some changes in Section 303 of the Magnuson Act, which describes what the council process is. And we're looking at inserting the NEPA analysis requirements that are in the original law so as to achieve the robust analysis of environmental effects that really is the essence of NEPA. And so all of those things, reasonable range of alternatives, intensified analysis on environmental effects, cumulative effects, all of those things that are in the original NEPA law, to put those in the Magnuson Act. Mandate that all this is put forward in front of the council prior to the council's final vote. And aligning the formal public comment processes so that they align not only with what currently is judged as a success in the Magnuson Act, but also the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, to try to achieve that more timely business so you can push forward some marine fishery management concepts and ideas without having to wait 1, 2, 3, 4 years to get a good idea through. Then, after having done that, adding a provision that if these processes are followed, then the Magnuson action is judged to have fulfilled NEPA. So this is kind of like the FACA exemption that's already in the Magnuson Act. The Federal Advisory Something Act, FACA, says that you're supposed to notice a meeting in advance, it's supposed to be open and transparent, and a variety of things that are in this FACA Act were put into the Magnuson Act. And there was also this provision that says if that is all followed, then the ending result is exempt from FACA. But we don't really want to leave anyone with the feeling that we're trying to get out of NEPA, that we're trying to be exempt from NEPA, but rather to comply with it and have accomplished all of the things that a good, thorough analysis of environmental impacts are, but just do it in a little bit more efficient manner. So we're going to try to flesh this out. We got some staff back at the office working on this. We're working with some of the other councils and try to have a white paper or some description of that for the annual CCC meeting in May. And I don't know who's the time person here. Am I okay? Okay. So let me go to the second one then. And that is gets to this question of data poor or data moderate stock assessments. These things are dealing with uncertainty when you really don't have the information you have from a full stock assessment. Everybody says it's data poor, you know that going in, and the current system has this highly buffered. So if you really don't know that much about a fish stock, you ought to have a pretty high scientific buffer. And you ought to have a pretty high management buffer. And you ought to pick a P-star value that gives you a big buffer. And the SSC says we got a sigma value that's big. And so you take great care to not make a mistake on some of these data poor situations. But when an ACL finally comes out, it's treated the same as one that comes out from a full stock assessment that you know quite a bit about. And so this is kind of coming to roost very recently at the Pacific Council at our March Council meeting for some nearshore rockfish species. And there were well, 3 of the state seats at the Pacific Council were calling to take some species out of the Magnuson Act. And if that's not, out of the FMP, and if that's not possible, how about getting these species out of the Magnuson Act authority? And so we all think this works pretty good. And so it was a little surprised to see that. And we think things can be made a little bit better. So one of the 18 or 20 priorities is calling for the congressional folks to explore more flexibility for fishery impacts on data poor species when the current precautionary approach becomes the bottleneck for healthy mixed stock fisheries. So this is a little different than flexibility to get out of it entirely. And we're afraid that maybe there's some other councils that might be looking at that a little differently than we are. So how much flexibility? we're not looking at a lot of flexibility. We don't want to tarnish our strong reputation for effectively dealing with overfishing as soon as it's identified and rebuilding depleted stocks effectively. So we're talking about rarely instituted flexibility, not commonly instituted flexibility, not for a whole bunch of stocks, not for data-rich stocks, and not flexibility to just ignore what comes out of a data-poor stock assessment, but maybe some flexibility on how you deal with what comes out of it. And the Pacific Council hasn't taken up a position on this, but as I say, it's starting to really come to a boil on the front burner at the Council with regard to these nearshore rockfish species. So what kind of flexibility? Well, maybe some flexibility to phase in the results. We heard Rick Mathot talk a little bit about phasing in yesterday. So maybe some flexibility to phase in together with a trigger for a mandate to more intensively analyze all the available data to see whether or not it can be validated that the stock is in trouble. Maybe some analysis of things not considered. Right now, the data poor methodologies are pretty tight, and other information that's around doesn't get into the methodology and doesn't get into the model. Maybe some analysis of the benefits of marine protected areas or the rockfish conservation area that doesn't seem to fit into the methodology yet for any credit of any sort, including maybe the sanctuary for the production of older more fecund fish. So we're looking at that as kind of an implementation challenge. So in closing, let me just reiterate that the Pacific Council is following the Magnuson Act business quite carefully, and it's of a great importance to the Council, and I will just bring it to a close with that, Merrick.
Good morning. Oh, I don't need that, do I? So I'm going to be really brief this morning. Dr. McIsaac bought me a nice scotch the other night in exchange for simply saying that if everyone would follow the lead and the example and the model of the preeminent Pacific Fishery Management Council, we'd all be in good shape and we wouldn't even need to be here today. But looking a little higher on the map to the north, I'll give you some perspectives from the North Pacific Council. And I'll just speak briefly to the what I call the 2006-2007 reauthorization. As Mr. Hindersheet characterized it yesterday, it was a hallmark piece of legislation, put into effect some very powerful set of requirements for annual catch limits, stock rebuilding, and ending overfishing. And even though it was only 2 or 3 sentences in the actual legislation, it did result in an extensive set of guidelines in order to give the council's guidance on how to do it. And even though it was patterned, at least partly, if not largely, after practices that have been in place in the North Pacific for decades, it did require our council to spend a lot of time over a period of years literally amending our fishery management plans to adhere to the letter of the provisions. And so it wasn't as if, oh, we're already doing it. It took a lot of work to get us to where we were in compliance with the letter. I just want to say that generally, we believe the current Magnuson-Stevens Act provides a very successful framework and that major changes are not necessary at this time. Dave Whaley made the comment yesterday that you go through a reauthorization process, and this will be, I think, the 3rd one I've been through, that you're likely to get 1 or 2 things you really like and probably 6 or 7 things that you don't like. And, but we do believe, and you're hearing a lot of talk around the country, and even from the North Pacific perspective, we're not opposed to modifications and flexibility in some areas with some caveats. And 4 focus areas have really emerged, and those are, of course, the annual catch limits, the stock rebuilding, data collection, and competing statutes. And I want to talk just quickly about a couple of things that we think are working well. The LAPP provisions, the 2006 reauthorization put in place the explicit authority to use these programs, type catch share program, and also put in place a pretty a pretty prescriptive set of provisions on what you had to do in order to develop those programs. And in the North Pacific, most all of our fisheries operate under some type of LAPP or catch share program, but they differ tremendously in design based on the different characteristics of each of these fisheries. And we want to make sure that we maintain that maximum flexibility to be able to tailor those programs to the specific fisheries involved. We're not in favor of additional provisions such as sunset dates or requirements for referendums. If there are region-specific concerns with the current LAPP provisions, we believe they should be addressed in a region-specific manner. They're absolutely a critical tool in our toolbox, and we want to make sure we maintain that. Excuse me. Annual catch limits. We've been using them for almost 40 years now in the North Pacific and are convinced that they're the cornerstone of sustainable management necessary to prevent overfishing. We also recognize some flexibility might be warranted, and that's particularly true for data poor stocks. And there may be some flexibility warranted for mixed stocks fisheries as well. But I'll just give you a quick example. In the North Pacific a couple of years ago, we had what I would characterize as an artificially low ABC set for Pacific octopus, and that was because of the lack of survey information. We were basically using historical catch information as a proxy. And we literally had to shut down some very lucrative pot cod fisheries because we hit the mark. And since that time, we've actually gotten better stock assessments, some stomach content analysis that's allowed us to actually establish a more reasonable, accurate ABC for octopus. But that's one example where data poor stocks and ACLs collide a little bit. We're going to need some flexibility as we continue to address uncertainty. We may have to do additional amendments to our groundfish plans with regard to fully implementing the ACL requirements in terms of uncertainty and buffers. And I want to make a comment about there has been legislation, not necessarily in the stuff you see in the bills that are currently on the table, but a couple of years ago, requiring outside peer review beyond our SSC. And we believe that a properly constituted SSC is the appropriate body to establish ACLs. And just a final thought on that. Economic considerations are important, but we can't get in the trap of trading long-term benefits for short-term gains, either in revenue or employment. And finally, that allowing ACLs to be set at the OFL, the overfishing level, is probably not a great idea. I think literally on average, mathematically over the long term, if you do that, you're probably going to be overfishing half the time. And so that's not something we support, although we do support flexibility. Similarly, with rebuilding plans, there's definitely room for flexibility there, greater consideration for economic and community impacts, particularly in light of the 10-year requirement, which is a bit arbitrary and probably inappropriate in many situations. There are proposals to use the T-min plus 1 generation, which is basically the minimum time it would take to rebuild plus 1 mean generation, and that's probably a very reasonable approach. Just in terms of the term overfished and the suggestions to replace that with depleted, I want to use the example that we have in the North Pacific with Pribilof blue king crab. That's a fishery where we have not had fishing for many decades on that fishery, and there's only minimal bycatch that occurs in other fisheries. And after numerous analyses, we found that fishing activities were found to have no effect or could not effect rebuilding nor affect the rebuilding success. And yet a rebuilding plan was mandated. So I think that's a prime example of where we need to differentiate those terms. And when we talk about flexibility with either rebuilding or with annual catch limits, we do have to keep in mind stock conservation has to be our primary focus. So one thing that hasn't been talked about much this week is the agency, National Marine Fisheries Service, is currently in the process of revising the guidelines implementing National Standard 1. And many of the things that we're talking about this week with regard to flexibility could be addressed to some extent within that revision. And so the timing of that relative to timing of a potential Magnuson reauthorization is kind of important. It would be great if we had those revisions done sooner, so we might be able to address a lot of those issues through that. Those of you that know me know I'm not going to talk about Magnuson reauthorization without talking a little bit about statutes and NEPA, and Don talked about this too. Up until about 15 years ago, we weren't really doing NEPA. I think in response to a series of litigations, we realized, well, we do have to comply with NEPA. And so we began to address NEPA through our analyses, but through what I would call NEPA Creep, NEPA has become the vehicle for all of our fishery management actions. And I think fisheries are kind of unique in that we have a very specific act, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and I think it's arguably the most transparent and participatory regulatory process in existence. And so there's a lot of redundancy with us having to use NEPA as the vehicle for our actions, and I think that was recognized in the 06 reauthorization that mandated a revision and a reconciliation of those processes. And there was a lengthy process of rulemaking, proposed rulemaking, that was ultimately repealed, unsuccessful. Currently, the agency is engaged in the development of a policy directive to try to respond to that. I would argue that that policy directive in its current incarnation is primarily memorializes status quo process. And we're doing a lot better job at NEPA, don't get me wrong, and we've learned to live with it. But I think that there is ample opportunity for us to truly streamline our analyses and review process and do that without compromising the underlying environmental protection intent of NEPA. And that's not what we're trying to do, is get out of that. And it won't reduce public input. The council process, through its process, and the secretarial review process under Magnuson provides ample opportunity for that. And we believe we can build certain specific requirements, perhaps an explicit environmental analysis requirement and a specific requirement for a reasonable range of reasonable alternatives into the Magnuson Act itself. And that's probably, as Mr. Hastings made the comment yesterday, it's simply common sense. And so I wanted to make that comment. Now, a few additions, my last slide, but I want to make some additional points that speak to some specific draft legislation and a couple of general thoughts. And you'll hear the words unintended consequences several times here probably. But generally, we would like to see legislation that allows for management flexibility and perhaps expressed in intended outcomes rather than prescriptive measures, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. When you do that, there is a trade-off between specificity and the need for lengthy, complex implementing regulations or guidelines. The ACLs is a good example. We also want to stress that if there are regional issues that people feel need to be addressed, then address them in a regional way and avoid the unintended consequences that may accrue to other regions. And there was, I'll move on. Unrealistic or expensive analytical mandates or timelines. There was a bill on the table back in 2011 that would have required extensive, comprehensive, coast-wide socioeconomic impacts to small businesses before the agency could implement a closure. Simply unrealistic. I'm going to skip because I'm running out of time, but I want to skip down toward the bottom and give you another example of what I think could be a situation we're setting up for unintended consequences. And our council has developed ecosystem plans for the Aleutian Island management area. We patterned our Arctic FMP largely in an ecosystem structure, and we're in the beginning stages of developing an ecosystem plan for our Bering Sea to underpin or overarch our Bering Sea fishery management plan. And there are provisions for councils to discretionarily develop ecosystem plans, but it goes on to say if you do this, you shall include this, and you shall include this metric, and you shall include these monitoring measures to track those metrics, and you shall include regulatory forcing mechanisms to respond to what comes out of those metrics. And I guess my point there is there's two things that could happen. Some councils are going to look up and say, well, we simply don't have the information to do that, and so we're not going to develop an ecosystem plan. Some councils are going to look at it and say, well, we might have that information. That's going to be a huge task for us to comply with those specific requirements. And further, that we could be painting ourselves into unknown corners by doing that. So this gets back to my first point about focusing on intended outcomes rather than prescriptive measures. And so as I'm running low on time, I just want to put a plug in for my very last bullet there, that preservation and enhancement of stock assessments must remain high, the highest, if not a super high priority, that we can't engage in successful implementation of annual catch limits if we don't have adequate stock assessments. And I'll just end with that point.